Hello there, Corey Pitzer here. And today, another session on my Fireside chats. Now, the person I want to introduce to you today is someone I learned to know in the past 2, 3 years of my life, Brian Maynard. Brian asked me to join him and a few others on designing and facilitating a process that was called the elimination of fatalities. It was an incredible experience in the first place to do this. We visited 39, 40 mine sites around the world, engaged with over 8,000 people in discussions about their work and about the key question, what could kill them while they do their work? Now, but more about that later. The first thing I want to introduce you to is Brian Maynard's career. A little bit on his views on management and leadership. He had a very senior position in many organizations in the mining industry around the world. And I hope you will learn a little bit from his experience about things. So Brian Maynard is my second guest in the series, and there are many more to come. Let me ask you to give a little bit of an overview of your career. When did you start shoveling rock on a mine and why?
Okay, so I guess the first time underground for me was in 1979. I was in a geological engineering program at university and needed to raise funds through the summer to then help fund the education. And as a mine beginner, in those days there was no safety instructions. You were given a shovel, new pair of boots, hard hat, belt, coveralls, and in my case, I was taken to a drainage ditch and told to fill up a 3-ton ore car, and they would come and collect me at the end of the shift. I remember my first day underground ever. My cap lamp bulb burnt out 5 minutes into the shift. And I knew there was a spare bulb in the setup, so I tried the spare bulb and it wouldn't come on either. So I tried to walk by using the rail and my boot. I walked about 3 meters or 10 feet, and then I realized it was so dark that it was pointless. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know whether there was any open holes. So I just sat. I sat for 7 hours and 55 minutes. Until 4 o'clock when my partner came back with the locomotive to pick me up. And of course, the first thing he did was to look into the wagon, and there was only one shovel full of mud. So then he thought I was lazy and just another lazy student. And then I told him that my light had burnt out 5 minutes into the shift, and he couldn't believe it because he'd never heard of that before. And he said, "So what'd you do?" And I said, "Well, I sat down. What else could I do? It's so dark." So he couldn't believe that I sat there for 7 hours and 55 minutes in the dark. Obviously, not most of us, once our career gets going, has that much time to think uninterrupted. And so it was really then that I fell in love with the mining industry, and some people think it should have been the opposite.
That's an amazing start. You think positively about it.
It was a pretty neat environment. The crew I worked with was from all over the world. So we had Danish, we had German, we had Austrian, we had Icelandic, we had Swedish, Norwegian, Canadian First Nations, Irish, Scottish. And so obviously I learned a lot about different cultures at lunchtime and a shift when everybody got together. And there was lots of biases and lots of prejudice. Some, in today's world, it would probably be called racist, but in those days, it was all about poking fun at one another and kind of help the day go by in a lighthearted way. I got hurt bad, smashed two discs in my neck by taking a shortcut one day riding on the back car of this 10-car train. And I went to throw my shovel off because I knew where I'd start work the next day. So rather than hopping off and setting my shovel to the side of the tunnel, I went to throw it. And of course, I wanted to make sure it landed right. So I was concentrating hard. I forgot that the ore chute was hanging down over the track. And so this steel chute nailed me in the side of the head, cracked my hard hat, ripped my cap lamp out of my belt, knocked me unconscious. Of course, the locomotive operator kept going because it was end of shift. When I woke up, I realized I had to walk back to the shaft and then somehow figure out how to get back to surface with the right side of my face scraped and bleeding. And I didn't want anybody to know. So I called the cave center. He came down to get me, and I faced him with the left side of my body so that he wouldn't be able to see my face. Got to surface, had a shower, and then went to my room in the men's residence and just stayed there, cleaned up and made sure that nobody would see me. So that was really my first experience at doing something, pretty stupid. Could have been obviously hurt a lot more than I was. And it was a good wake-up call for then the rest of my career after graduation. Then I went up into Northern Canada for a mining company. I was with that company for 30 years. First 10 years were in technical services, obviously with my engineering degree. And then I moved into operations through the ranks to become a mine manager. And that's really when I realized that all those interactions with monthly safety meetings and unsafe conditions underground that I would see on a regular basis as a mining engineer came to light that I didn't really know very much about safety systems, and then started to work on gaining knowledge. And you see all sorts of things, people taking shortcuts because they'd taken them before and nothing had gone wrong. People arguing over stats because there was a big competition between the mines over who was the best in terms of a safety point of view. And there was all sorts of emotion around the disabling injury statistic, which was where you couldn't come back to work and perform 80% of your normal routine, or lost time incident, obviously, where you were sitting at home. And so we would get incidents where someone would get dust in their eye and they wanted some time off. So they would talk to the doctor, and the doctor would write a slip, doctor slip, sick slip, giving them time off. And right away that would become an LTI. And so the supervisor and the mine captain, superintendent would get all upset that it wasn't fair that they got this LTI in their record for dust in the eye. And so what I realized was that we can't change the way the doctor-patient relationship is overnight. That's going to take some time, bringing the medical community into the mine, showing them around, showing them the hazard elimination program that we had underway. And finally, I said to the supervisors at a monthly safety meeting, look, if somebody gets hurt to the point where they have to go see a doctor, then we're not doing our job. So this isn't about cuts and bruises. This is where they come to the first aid office at the mine, and the first aid attendant says, you need to go see a doctor. So let's stop complaining about disabling injuries and LTIs and start looking at medical aids. And if we can create a workplace where people aren't going to get banged up to the point where they have to go see a doctor, then we won't need to worry about disabling injuries and LTIs that aren't real. And then it comes to walk the talk. So then the supervisors are wondering whether this guy that's pushing different stuff is actually serious about it, or is it just flavor of the month? And we make mistakes. And one of the worst mistakes in supervision or management for me is the permitted occasion. So that's where somebody is taking on an unsafe act and we don't do anything about it. We just keep on walking or go back to surface. And I think at that point, the person who was committing the unsafe act, whether premeditated or not, owns a little piece of us. And so the only way we can get that back is to gather everybody together, talk about the mistake we made, and that from today forward, we've got different expectations. And the next time that unsafe behavior is observed, then there'll be a coaching and or a counseling and or a disciplinary discussion. And I think that was really the next learning then when it came to accountability versus responsibility, because I think those two words get used interchangeably and they are very different.
Yeah.
And so we had to come up with examples, otherwise we couldn't get the crews and supervisors to understand the difference between those two words. So we brought some real life examples to the foreground so that people would understand the difference between the two. And then there was nervousness in the union ranks that accountability was always going to lead to discipline. And so we really had to coach people on the difference between calling people to account and holding people to account. In my view, you can't hold someone accountable if you don't first call them to account for their actions. Why did they make the decision that they did? And if you can ask a series of questions, you'll find out that they got to a certain fork in the road. You thought they were going to go to the left, but they went to the right. And that's when you can really get into coaching discussions and or find out that you've got a problem with your system or your process or the procedure or that there's a rule that's impossible to follow. And then, of course, what came next was moving into the GM role where I was in charge of more than one operation, so I could see the incidents from the other sites. So even though we had a learning from incident program where we're supposed to know about what's happening at the other sites, including the plants, you kind of come up against the, well, it wouldn't happen here routine. But as GM, you start to see trends, and we had one guy broke his wrist, one cage tender broke his wrist, and then I find out at another mine that a cage tender broke his wrist, and then I met the third one on a safety visit, waiting to go to surface, and I see a cage tender bring a heavy load underground. And then as the load is coming off of the cage onto the rail, he puts his hand in the wrong place, just like the other two did, only I was able to stop him. And so I said, do you know how long it takes to spot the cage correctly, level with the rail, so that it doesn't bang up and break your wrist? No, we don't have time. I said, well, let's try it. So it took 3 seconds to make that operation safe each time. But they felt like they didn't have 3 seconds. So how did we create a culture where people don't have 3 seconds to actually make things safer? So that really led then to discussion around routine tasks and non-routine tasks, and the concept that supervision was actually made up of 2 words: supervision. And so as a manager or a supervisor, we should be looking for things that the crew doesn't necessarily see, and coaching them through that, and using photographs, because it's quite a powerful tool when you show somebody a picture of an unsafe condition that they wouldn't normally see day to day. So it was also at that point when I realized that as a GM, I had been handing out pretty serious discipline above what the manager was handing out. And I made a commitment to the union president that if any of our employees got to the end of the road in the discipline system, that I would notify him so that we could take some sort of different corrective action, or he could personally get involved. So then it came back to, why am I having to do that? And I realized that the supervisors were seeing many unsafe acts more than me, because I was underground or in the workplace twice a week. They were in the workplace every day. So they clearly weren't doing anything about it. So I worked with a retired safety professional who created a program called Safe Production. I took the supervisors through that over a 1 week period, 26 in 1 week, 26 in the second week. And then explain to them on the final day of that course that I was going to stop disciplining the crew members and start disciplining them, because clearly they were seeing things and not doing anything about it. And that's really when things started to change. So then, of course, they started to complain that there was things getting in their way. Systems were getting in their way, rules and procedures were getting in their way. And we then spent the next year having open and honest conversations about what they were and starting to address them and make them more efficient, effective, and ultimately safer. Then I moved to another business unit in the same company, came across a completely different culture. It was a much bigger operation. And so I had to focus a little bit differently now to understand where they had come from and why they were the way they were. So that was a big learning for me. Made a number of mistakes along the way. The biggest one was a very bad near miss. we'd had a good run at the operation with no serious accidents, and I'd been asked to go on a corporate initiative for 2 weeks, so I wasn't at the site. And we had a daily safety report that came out to everybody, and my operation had a first aid visit on one day, and then another first aid visit on day 2, and then another first aid visit on day 3. Now, I should have reacted because that was quite unnormal, but I didn't because they were just first aid visits. And on day 4, a crusher had been locked and tagged out so that work on the grizzly in the ore pass above that crusher could be performed. The grizzly needed to be repaired. So it's a steel grate, essentially. And so the welder had climbed down onto the ledge and standing on the broken ore while he then welded the rim so that a new steel grate could be laid on top of that rim. And as he was climbing back up out of that hole, on the following day, the next crusher operator didn't know that the crusher had been locked and tagged and started it up. And so that muck pile started to move, and he would have been swallowed into the crusher. Luckily, he was able to grab onto the ladder, which was just resting on a 1-inch ledge. And so that was a near miss that was really basically a fatality. So he was unscathed. And that's really when I realized that whether it's a near miss or first aid or medical aid or an LTI, if it could lead to loss of life, then it needs to be dug into much deeper than we traditionally do. Yeah. And so I changed my routines, started to really look for fatal risk behaviors or fatal risk conditions rather than just using statistics or using reports. And again, it was about leading the way, right? So I had to change my behavior in order for people to believe that we were really serious about that. You know, and then along the way, you have different leaders, and so you learn from them. You think about words that they use, and I was lucky to have many good ones.
Which is the best one of the lot? What did you learn from the best leader?
Well, I think one of the sayings was he an idiot when we hired him, or did we turn him into one 30 years later? And so that really gets to, you know, how we behave as supervisors, the culture that we allow. And we all have superstars on our crew as people that drive us nuts. And so that saying was really good because it forced me to then really look at why was the person behaving like they were? Was it because it was tolerated in the past? Or were they one of those 3 or 4% of the people that actually aren't suited to the mining industry, and our job is to provide them with an opportunity to work in an industry that's more suited to them. Now, obviously, union executive don't really like that last sentence, but it's the reality. We're not made for some aspects of real life business. And then, you know, if the crew is behaving badly, then I think we have to dig into why. And it's quite often that there's only one or two people on the crew that are causing the problem. And when management doesn't deal with them, then the rest of the crew goes, well, why should we bust our arse when these two aren't and nothing is happening? And quite often when you discipline someone for repeat poor behavior, the other members of the crew will come to you and say, it's about time. Why did it take you so long?
Yeah.
So there's that balance between sort of the hammer and putting your arm around their shoulder and having a chat. And that's not something they typically teach you in university back in those days. I'm not sure what they do now. HR skills aren't typically given to mining engineers. And when you get enough confrontations through grievance processes with unions, you realize that not everything is black and white. So my view was there's three sides to every story: employee A, employee B, and mine. Because ultimately, they don't always come clean as to what happened or who said what. And so you have to dig. And in the case of that union president I was talking about earlier, he and I saved more careers than the ones that we toss aside, but not too many people know that because of our relationship and trying to sort people out. You know, and then I moved up to become president of a business unit. And so what struck me then was when you're standing in the ditch with a shovel, that's one thing. But then, you know, 20 years later, when you're now the president, it really causes you to reflect back on all the people that supported you and all the system changes that were made, things that worked, things that didn't work. And to make time, because your time can be chewed up with meetings and worse with preparation for a meeting. And today I see too many supervisors getting caught up in preparing for a meeting rather than just going to the meeting with their knowledge in their head and the experience and skills that they have to talk through what the more senior people want from that particular session. And it takes them out of the workplace, and they need to be in the workplace with the crews.
Is that a difference in terms of supervisors that you've noticed over the years, where they used to be more in the workplace and now much less?
I think it's roughly the same. The one thing that's changed is there are supervisors and superintendents that don't like confrontation. And so with the ability to perform more tasks on a tablet or a computer, skills that they're pretty good at, they would rather do that than to get into a confrontation with a crew member in the workplace.
So when you moved to the role of president, during that time, did you experience a difference in the way that the corporate office, whatever that meant in this organization, do you think there was a true commitment to take care of people, or was safety seen as we have to do this to get the numbers right so that the board looks at the right numbers? What did you think came from the top of the organization?
It was probably a bit of both. They expected you to look after things. And so they didn't want any bad press or bad media as a result of a serious incident. at the same time, you wouldn't have been put into the role if they didn't trust that you knew how to look after the operation. So there was a lot of give and take. Maybe the one aspect where it was a bit trickier was when you've got senior people in the corporate office that don't have a lot of heavy industry experience, and they think you can change something quite quickly. And my observation, it can take quite a while to get certain things changed because you have to engage with people in order for them to understand why you're making the change. And as you advance in the organization, your time with the crews becomes less and less and less. And so then you have to put your trust in other people to perform that engagement. And I think it is hard for the head office to come to grips with why things take so long.
But how did you make sure then the message of we want the right numbers in safety, we don't want accidents, and you said it's a bit of both. There's also, you did care about people. You did care about your employees.
Right.
So how did they know that you cared? What told them that you cared about them as people in the organization?
Well, I think there's the at work stuff, and then there's the after work stuff when you're out in the community, and so you can't be one way at work and then a different way out in the community. But at work, irregardless of what your role is, whether it's in operations or maintenance or finance or legal or HR, you've got team members, and in my view, you just have to get away from your desk and go engage with your coworkers.
Yeah.
And so then it's, I think the buzz phrase is visible felt leadership, but that can get complicated too, because it can be turning into an exercise where you've got to write down what you heard and what you saw and do it twice a week. Even if it's not natural to you, you got to force yourself to get out and meet with coworkers.
So at this point as well, where you now the president, and by this time your management philosophy has probably been set up for yourself in your own mind, how you manage. You've now got 20 years of experience. And so one of the things that you mentioned to me during our time together on this road trip is the statement, if the baby is blue. How did that come about? And maybe an example in that first 20 years of your career.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of things that people do to become more productive or more cost effective or safer. And so we build these teams to go out and find out what can we do, how can we do it differently in order to make the business more successful. And a couple of things there. Number one, there are lots of times when the team delivers 85% of the target that was set for them. And they've taken the workplace or the site or the business unit to a much better place in safety, cost, or production. But then in the push to get that last 15%, they get bogged down, and then morale drops, and then they think it was a waste of time. So I think when a team gets 80-85% of the target and they're struggling the next month, then just stop. Celebrate their achievement because they've clearly made a big change. And then if you decide that you want that other 15 to 20% of the original goal, then I think you have to build a different team, maybe with a different skill set. But is it really necessary to get the other 15 or 20, or is it time to move on? Then there's system changes or initiatives that we put in along the way in our career, and they just aren't getting any traction. And before we finish, we get moved. So we get moved laterally to a new position, or we get promoted. And so somebody comes in to take our place. And I never wanted them to be handcuffed by the things that I had put in place. So in order to encourage them to really, take their own lead, I would use the phrase, and it was a bit rough. If I've given birth to something that's struggling to breathe and it can't be fixed, then kill it. And, the second one along with that, and of course, that causes people to be a bit nervous just with that phrase. But I think it slows the company down too much if we keep trying to save things that really have no bearing on improvement. And I think the other thing is, one of the biggest excuses is initiative overload, that there are too many initiatives coming to the site. And sometimes it's true, but sometimes it's just a case of we've put too many airplanes up in the air and they're buzzing around and they're in a holding pattern. We got to start getting those airplanes down onto the ground before we put more airplanes up in the air.
So that is especially these days, and maybe things are changing now since this whole pandemic onset. But what we tend to do, in my observation over 30 years, is that organizations tend to build up their corporate head offices as a center of excellence and driving the new things in the organization. And it builds up and it starts getting so bloated up there that each individual department or individual in there, they have a new idea, they have a new initiative, and it starts being pushed into the organization, and it starts to strangle, making the babies blue down there. There's no oxygen for them to breathe anymore, overstatement, and then organizations tend to, over time, then start to decentralize. No, the real decisions need to be made down there. Let's take away this bureaucracy and let things happen down there. I'm sure you've seen that too. What was your philosophy? Is it a top down, or is it a bottom up success?
Well, I think maybe again a bit of both. I think we have to spend more time understanding the context, understand why they're pushing it, and sometimes in the corporate sense, it's because the leaders at the top want it to be done, and maybe sometimes they can't share all of the context for various reasons. If it's a case where they're asking for our support at site, then it's much easier, because you want to help make the company better. But when it comes through maybe a function in a corporate office, and you're not totally convinced that it's aligned with the corporate strategy, then there's different ways of dealing with that. One is to be an active resistor. One is to be a passive resistor. One is to sort of, put your rain hat on and wait for the storm to pass, and then get back to doing things the way that it used to be done. And that can be both from the top and from the bottom. I think when the crews bring things forward, there's a difference between listening and hearing what they said. And so we tend to do a lot of listening, but have we really heard what they said? And my observation is, if you can get two crew members to willingly take something on themselves, by giving them the support and making sure that their actions are safe, then you're going to go a long ways to then getting more ideas from the rest of the crews. But I think all too often we put supervisors in a position where these things come at them both from the above and below, and they don't really know how to prioritize them and make enough time to really dig into the value of that suggestion. But it's pretty amazing when people dig into them and start to take them on, because they are then ingrained in it can be done, and then we're willing to take on the second one.
Yeah. There's obviously often strategic shifts that need to happen that are going to change the organization in a long-term way. Right. Those kind of things cannot be waited for to bubble up from the bottom of the organization, because it's not going to happen. You have to have these foresight, and that's what strategic management is all about. That's what the corporation needs to be able to do, is to look forward and make those things happen. The thing is, people can trample their operations with all these initiatives. And I'm asking this because I know also that you've actually had an experience of being trained by Deming, who was this. A lot of the younger people probably don't even know who Deming was, but his whole philosophy. And I want to do a fireside chat with you about him as well, and his philosophies and principles, and all of what he was saying, and we have to make the processes more lean, so that we don't overburden the person at the front end. One of the principles. And you've also, and I know in the latter part of your career, was the head of BI, business improvement, for a large corporation, where the operating model of the organization is where everything should happen. How do we get all these initiatives and all these longer term ideas integrated upstream, so that it comes out fluently when it reaches and hits the front end supervisor, that ultimate level of performance?
Yeah, I guess the piece that's one of the hardest things to do, and maybe that's why we struggle a bit, is to build the value case. And I think sometimes there's tangible things that you can put a value to, and there's intangible things maybe that people think they can't put a value to it. But I think if the brainstorming session is well facilitated, and you understand what the tangible things are, and you understand what the intangible things are, I think there are other people in the organization that can help you put a value on those intangible things, because what's intangible to one person might be tangible to another. And so then all of a sudden the value case becomes much more clear. And then, one of the other things, that I learned over the years, curling, actually, in the sport of curling, was if your team wanted you to play a shot and you didn't really think it fit with the strategy of that particular game, or that end in the game, you could say to them, let's assume that we made that shot perfectly as what you guys are describing. What do you think the other team is going to do? If they play this shot, then we're going to be in a very awkward situation. So even being perfect on what you want to do isn't going to get you to where you need to be. And I think if the value case in a business is solid, then the next question is, if we deliver it as expected, will it take us to a better place? Or is it just a nice to have?
Right.
Which then you can do your ranking and your prioritization. It doesn't mean that someday that one won't come to the top of the pile. But there's only so much resource, there's only so much time, there's only so much budget. And so we got to make sure that we take on the right things.
No, that's I think the whole focus on business excellence is a topic that is. I mean, we can have several more fireside chats about that. But you've also experienced an international role, and you worked in Eastern Europe for a very large corporation there, transitioning from a very secure, uniform Canadian environment. How did you step into that environment that was very, very different?
Yeah, I think obviously moving laterally, even in Canada, exposed myself and others to very different cultures. So maybe that helped a little bit. I think it really came down to immersing myself in their world, particularly for the first 90 days, which is another belief of mine, that in a new role, you really need to take 90 days to understand the situation before you start making proclamations or setting expectations. In that case, there was a very rules-based culture and a very strong focus on following the rules, or you would be disciplined.
What kind of mining
And
was this? This was in Poland, was it?
it was in Ukraine.
In
A
Ukraine.
very,
What kind of mining
very
did they
large iron ore
do? Iron
open
ore.
pits,
All
very
right.
large processing plants, and a lot of people depended on the business to be successful in order to have gainful employment. And so then it was a very, very big operation with more than 11,000 people. And so once again, you're not going to be able to convert everybody to try new things. So how do you convert 2 people? And then how do you convert 4? And then how do they help you convert 8 and 16 and 32? And so I suppose I could have fallen into the trap of preaching, which luckily I don't think I did, but rather gain the trust of the leaders at site to be able to put on a hard hat and go into the workplace. And obviously there was language barriers. So then it was about the difference between interpretation and translation, and making sure that it wasn't just translation, that it was actually what was the person really trying to get across in what they were saying. And I think that's where the visibility factor really came into place, so that I wasn't just viewed as being a spy or as a senior manager that was looking for people that were performing unsafe acts. And again, just being true to them and being true to yourself, spending time in the community on the weekends. They had a very long and successful time in business. So why should they believe what this person from the West was telling them? And so then it almost became more of show me rather than tell me. Because if there was an easier way to do things, then they were very interested in what you had to show them. I came across 2 welders one day performing unsafe work. And when I came across the workplace to talk to them, they were both extremely nervous because they thought I was going to fire them from the company employment. But I worked with the translator, and we got into a discussion around why they weren't wearing the right protective gear for a welding operation. And it turns out that they couldn't afford to buy it, and that the company hadn't provided it for them. And it's always hard to get commitment about doing it safer later in the day or tomorrow and for the rest of their career. But I asked them both if they had grandchildren, of which they did. And I said to them, so how are you going to feel if your grandchild is sitting on your knee and you can't see them because a welding spark went into your eye and you lost your eyes? And of course, that hurt because they didn't want to ever be in a situation where they couldn't see their family members because they were blind. And so at the end, when I asked them for their commitment to then follow the procedures in the future, would they give me that commitment? They did. And it wasn't hollow. It wasn't like, yeah, we'll give you our commitment and then you'll bugger off and we can go back to the way we're doing it. So it's about finding things that people can relate to and they can internalize so that they can change their behavior. No different than me getting speeding tickets through most of my life. And at some point when you get the letter saying you're on the edge of losing your license, then you have a decision to make. Are you going to behave differently or not?
Yeah, yeah. It starts becoming internalized very quickly then.
Yeah.
No, that's very interesting, Brian. I think we probably at the end of our first fireside chat, and we've only covered one of your famous, what I call Brianisms. But this was really to get a little bit behind into your career. And what I would like to do, and people listening to this I want to just foreshadow a little bit what we're going to do as well. I like to have maybe a few of these fireside chats with you to look at the rest of your career, and also to have a bit of a chat about your experience with Deming, and how you integrated the quality principles into your own world and into your career later on. So that would be a great chat, because I believe that Deming's views are actually what the safety field, the safety discipline, is now starting to get to grips with, in terms of the so-called new view in safety that had already been espoused by Deming way back, and we're only now starting to think in those terms. And I really want to have a chat with you about that, because it's as if this whole new approach in safety is something new. What it isn't actually. It is something that's been very well established through the quality movement, so to speak. So I'd like to have another chat with you then, and then maybe a third one where we have a little bit of a chat about, probably in my mind, I think is a real highlight in your career, was a highlight in my career, was around the elimination of fatalities. In the end, that's what we want to do in safety, and there's some fascinating things that I'd like to share with the viewers on the issue of elimination of fatalities in that third session. So if you're okay with that, I'm going to book you in for 2 more. If you're sitting there in a beautiful Caribbean island and a lovely environment, beautiful sunshine and everything. So I think I can make good use of your relaxation if we can do this.
All right. I look forward to that. Thank you very much.